So the theme of my Easter teaching this year is Easter, let it change you. And that's the idea, is that the resurrection has changed so much in our world, and it's changed so many people's lives and transformed so many lives. But you have the choice to choose to let it change you or to choose to ignore it. And I want to talk about that kind of dichotomy of that way, because there are people in the world today that act like the resurrection never happened and live their lives. And there are people whose lives have literally been transformed from the ground up, just changed completely. Hearts, minds, whole trajectory of life because of the resurrection. When I was a kid, I think I focused on that other world so much. So Easter came up and I was focused on the candy. I was focused on the Easter egg hunt. Reese's eggs, anybody? Come on, testify. Hallelujah, right? I mean, but pre-diabetes Clark, really love those, yes. I always talk about food all the time, then I'm like, mystery how I got diabetes. But anyway, just love those things, right? The more peanut butter, the better. The ratio is right on those, and those Christmas trees, the ratio of peanut butter and chocolate is right on those. But anyway, Easter gatherings with family, getting together, having ham, getting together, hunting eggs, that all was Easter to me prior to about 14. And then at 14, I became aware of this Jesus guy who was really, I knew about him, like I knew of him in the world, but I didn't really know him very much. I wasn't following the way of Jesus. I knew facts about him, but it hadn't changed my life. And so I keenly am aware that there are people today that are celebrating Easter. I even saw some at a store recently that were talking it up about Easter, and I thought, we are talking about two very different observances today as we talk about Easter. And so I'm aware that there's two things in our world going on at Easter time, right? There's Easter, and then there's like a separate thing going on that recognizes the significance, the underlying significance of all the things happening on the outside. I don't know if you remember Publishers Clearinghouse. When I was a kid, I remember watching videos of these people showing up at a door with roses and balloons and this huge check and knocking on the door and like, you have won. And they're just like, I'm a millionaire. And they're just freaking out, right? And I remember getting in the mail a mailer that said, you may have won the Publishers Clearinghouse, and being so excited and ripping into it and like, we are set. And then, I won some address labels with my name spelled wrong on it. I can make my own address labels. I don't need address labels. I need that $1 million. And so I want you to think about for just a moment, put your thinking imagination cap on for a minute. And if you heard that knock at your door and you peeked out, like we all do, right, to make sure it's not somebody trying to sell you something, you peeked out and you saw a dude in a jacket with balloons, a lady with roses, one guy with a big check, and a video camera. Are you opening that door? I'm going to say I would. Because I'm very averse to all scams. Like we know the scams, right? That prince that's sending you that email with that $1 million offer, that's not real, right? Okay. Do not go to CVS or Walgreens and buy gift cards because you got to pay your taxes with them to someone over the phone, right? You all know that's false. This is not news, right? I'm a little scared here. Yeah, no, we know. We're very scam averse, right? We know we're getting scammed a lot, and we have to be careful with that stuff. And so I would be very skeptical if there was someone like that on my doorstep. But am I going to check? Well, the payoff is pretty big if it's real. So I'm probably going to have a conversation with these people on my doorstep and say, what's up, guys? Because that would be really cool. And to me, the resurrection's kind of like that. You can be skeptical of it, and I think it's appropriate to be skeptical of it because we are 2,000 years past this event, right? Just like anything in the past, we have to look through the lens of what was written down about it. I don't know Aristotle, but I fully believe that he existed, right? I don't know Plato, but I believe he existed through what's written down. I never met some of these people, but I believe they existed, and I know about their history by what was written down about them and through recorded history. But we can approach things with skepticism, but not be illogical with our skepticism, if that makes sense. Like, it would be simple and silly for me to be like, well, I don't know Aristotle. We've never had coffee before, so he did not exist. Therefore, he did not exist. I could say the same thing about George Washington. I could say the same thing about a number of people. I've never met Bill Gates. I don't believe he exists, right? You would be like, you're some kind of special, right? I mean, you would be like, good luck with all that, and you would get away from me because you would realize that that's true. I've never had that personal relationship with these people, and yet at the same time, just because I haven't doesn't mean they don't exist, whether they're here now or they're in our history. And so it's wise to be skeptical. And I think it's okay to be a doubter, definitely, and to check things out, right? But at the same time, it's silly to be completely illogical with what we have. And so that's what I want to look at today, because there's something interesting happening in our world. There was recent research. It was just published this last week, and so I'm sharing with you fresh data that comes from a group called the Barna Group. And I share them every once in a while because they do really interesting religious research in our country and across the world. And something that they found really jumped out to me. And that is that today, more adults in America are saying they've made a commitment to follow Jesus, and it is still important in their life today. Now look at this. This goes back just to 2021, but look at the trend. It's trending upward. This is the first time in a long time we've seen a trend that goes upward. You know, I've been in ministry, I've been a pastor since 2000, and so all I saw for the first 20 years was just down, 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 down. Baptisms down, people coming to church down, religion in America down, 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 down. This is the first time we're starting to see this upward trend, and people are like grasping at straws to explain it. They want to explain it. Could it be the insanity in our world? Could it be the anger and the hurt? Could it be the social media fueled kind of things breaking families apart, and people are just starting to walk away from that and go, no, 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 I don't want to be a part of that. Could it be people reconsidering the claims of Christ? Now, there is a stereotypical thing that usually comes up at this point, and people say, well, America is graying, it's becoming older. And older people think more about God because they're nearing the end of their life, and they start thinking about that. And I know that sounds awful, and yet that's exactly what people say most of the time when you present research like this. They're like, well, that's just happening because people are getting older. But would you believe that the research shows the opposite? It shows that Gen X and boomers actually are trending down, and that Gen Z and millennials are trending upwards in their personal commitment to Christ. This is mind-blowing. And I'm telling you, the researchers are like scrambling to explain this. And there's a lot of explanations. It's not proven yet. This is what the early research is showing. But there's a lot of interesting things here to say that the younger generations are giving up on the madness of the world, and they're starting to come back and say, man, there's got to be something better than whatever is being produced in my world. Now that's important, because that means we can approach the claims of resurrection, which is the central claim of Easter Sunday. It is called Resurrection Sunday in the Christian calendar for a reason, because the resurrection is what the early disciples were preaching about Jesus. It is the foundation of the church. It is what I call the linchpin of everything. If the resurrection is true, it all matters, and if the resurrection is false, none of it matters. We are not a social service organization. We're not here to just throw Tupperware parties or fun parties, right? We're not here just to have a concert. We're not here to just listen to a guy talk. Like, all of this is key, but all of this is centered on the resurrection of Jesus. Either it happened or it didn't. If it happened, it has huge, scary implications for our life. If it didn't happen, it also has huge, scary implications in the other way for our life. But either way, it is a transformative event. So we need to, as skeptics and doubters and people with logical minds, we need to be able to look at what data exists and to understand that. So I want to present to you some of that today that I have time for. I don't have time for all of it. There's a lot out there. But I'm going to present to you a shortened version, an abbreviated version of what I think are some of the most compelling parts of that. And it starts with what happens in the immediate moments recorded in the New Testament after Jesus was crucified. So if we look in Matthew chapter 28, what we have here is literally right after Matthew's account of the death of Jesus on the cross, the burial of Jesus. And it's important to note that Jesus was not thrown into a mass grave like would have been common with the other two that were crucified with Jesus. There were 3 people crucified the day that Jesus died. 3 people nailed to a cross, put to death for crime, and so they were common criminals. And what would have happened usually is the Romans would have taken them down off the cross and just thrown them into a common grave, a pit. So if that had happened, then there never would have been an empty tomb to talk about, right? It would have been easy to say Jesus' body was stolen or something. But the Pharisees, right before this in chapter 27, they they say no to Pilate, this Roman leader. They say, look, you can't just let his body go because they're going to say he was resurrected. And so we want soldiers there. So he sends soldiers. He seals it. They seal the tomb, and they put soldiers there. Now, verse 1 of chapter 28, that's where it gets interesting, because this is early on Sunday morning, and it says, as the new day was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to visit the tomb. So they're just going to visit the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it. His face shone like lightning. His clothing was as white as snow. And the guards shook with fear when they saw him, and they fell into a dead faint. Then the angel spoke to the women. Don't be afraid, he said. I know you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He isn't here. He is risen from the dead, just as he said would happen. Come see where his body was lying. Now, one of the reasons we tend to be skeptical about that account, even recorded as history as it is, recorded in 4 different ways in the Gospels, is that most of us have not had an experience even similar to that. We can read stuff in here and go like, yeah, I've had a similar experience to that. I've heard conversations like that. The parables that Jesus teaches, we're like, oh yeah, I get that. That's something like that has happened in my life. But when you talk about angels coming down, people being resurrected, and we go, this is something different. And so I'm very skeptical because I don't have any personal experience with that. Now, there are tons of things in the world that I don't have personal experience with that I do believe in and that I do believe happened. But this is a pretty unique one, right? This is really unique because this is death being defeated. And boy, that has huge implications for me and for you, because we're all on a timeline and we all have an end to that timeline, and we don't know when that's coming. But we know from evidence that everyone that's ever born dies. They have a finite life on this planet. So that's huge. That's got huge implications. If what Jesus has done here applies to me and applies to you, then that's got enormous ramifications. That is very, very big. It's interesting to note that even those big ramifications, people were very critical of those, especially in the secular community and in Jewish communities in the early first century. And one of the philosophers that I studied that was very angry is, or I'm going to say angry. That's my interpretation of his reading. There's no emotions in it. But I feel like the way the vitriol he comes out this with, he's really angry. His name's Celsus. And Celsus we know a little bit about. He was in 175 AD. He was a pagan philosopher that was very critical of the idea of resurrection. And he said, case in point, he said basically, is that they should have been written better. That if they wanted us to believe this, they should have been written better. That they are written sporadically, they're written haphazardly, and they don't really seem to go together very well. He's talking about the gospel accounts of resurrection. He says if you wanted a compelling story and a convincing story, it's not what we have here. Instead, in the Gospels, we have this kind of fractured narrative that is rather restrained. It's rather sober. It doesn't seem to be embellished that much, except with this resurrection part. And he says, if you want us to believe in resurrection, why not just have Jesus magically disappear off the cross? Why not have Jesus' first return be to Romans, to government leaders, to people that are important in seats of power, so they could then tell other people about it? But you have Jesus appearing to normal people, to regular folks. And he said, he just kept going after it. And then he went after one thing that in 2025 we especially think is kind of funny and silly to hear, but made total sense to his audience. Celsus said, and you're telling me that, basically he said, you're telling me that the witnesses of this are women? Are you kidding me? Ooh. That got serious, and we're like, you don't want any ham today, do you, Pastor? You're not going to eat today. It's not me, it's Celsus. I mean, I'll give you his words. Look. Who really saw the resurrection? A hysterical woman? Gasp across the crowd. But this is how they thought. Women couldn't own property. Women can't be testifying in court. Their testimony is useless. And we say, well, we're so much better than that. Are we? I mean, women couldn't vote in our country at first. When could they hold a credit card without their husband's permission? Ooh, that's not that long ago. That's in our timeline. That's recent. And so we're not that disconnected from this kind of society. It's not so foreign. And yet, this is his crux of his argument. It's funny to us a little bit in 2025. But I think what it really does his entire argument is women are the deal. And then his entire argument is you could have written it better. I'm like, Celsus, did you not put this together that you actually prove these things written are true instead of disprove them? Or at least prove that the people writing them believe them? For if I wanted to write a fictional story, I could have done a lot better job. I mean, if you have a rudimentary understanding of the elements around the crucifixion, almost anyone in this room could have written a better, more compelling case. You could have written it better, made it structured together. You could have made the four Gospels align exactly. Instead, they're more like witness accounts at a court testimony. If you've ever watched any of court TV or anything like that, you know that multiple witnesses see the same thing happen, but kind of give their own perspective, where they saw it from and how they perceived it and how they remembered it. And that's what we see in the Gospels. It's more like just regular people telling you what they saw, what they witnessed, what they observed. Celsus, in his attempt to disprove the resurrection account, doesn't prove the resurrection by any means, but he actually kind of gives evidence and credence to this idea that what the people wrote down, they actually believed. They weren't trying to embellish it and make it all perfect and fit together magically, but it is the account of different people that saw something happen. In fact, if we failed to believe in it, Smith Wigglesworth said it this way. He said, there's nothing impossible with God. All the impossibility is with us when we measure God by our limitations, by our unbelief. See, with God, these things are possible. Now, I mentioned today that how we understand things in the past is what written records we have, and we take all the data available to us, and then we have logic, right? We have a brain. God's given us a brain to think with, and we bring those two things together, and we come up with theories about what has happened in our past. Everything from the creation of the universe to how history happened, all of this happens, and we put these things together, and we base our conclusions on what data we have. And we have philosophy to guide us through that. We have theory, and we have logic. And then, of course, what written records do exist still. And so we put all this together, and that's how we make decisions about what we believe in the current day. Now, philosophy's given us a lot of tools, and I'm going to mention one today several times to you that I have found very valuable, and it is called Occam's razor. It was developed in the 14th century by a friar named William of Occam, and he was basically a pastor, priest kind of guy. And his idea was very simple, that basically when you have to make a decision on something, the simpler solution, the one that requires fewer assumption, is usually more true. And so it's not a complicated tool, but it is a tool of philosophy to help us understand our modern world, to help us understand when we're given choices here. And he simply said, it's the simpler solution that's usually correct versus the more complex, versus the thing that makes a lot of assumptions that are not warranted. A real simple way to think of it that has been reduced down over the years is this idea that if you hear hoofbeats behind you, something you can't see coming, you could safely assume those are horses and not zebras, like not a herd of zebras behind you. And that makes a lot of sense to us, right? We're like, yeah, that makes sense. For zebras to be on the loose in a herd in Oklahoma, that would require a lot of assumptions. But for horses, that's a lot more likely. The Navy has a similar thing, keep it simple, stupid, right? The idea of KISS, to keep it simple. You have been through this before when you've had a little tickle in the back of your throat. You've gone to WebMD and it's like you're probably dying and you're like, right? You freak out because you jump to all these assumptions. Then you go to your doctor and he's like, you're not dying. Take 2 of these and call me in the morning. I went to an emergency room when I was in my 20s and I said, I am certain I'm having a heart attack. This is the end. It's the big one. And the doctor gave me some Pepcid AC and said, please go away. He said, you're in your 20s. You're healthy. It's all up here. And I was like, no, it's real. It really hurts in here. He's like, yeah, that's what acid does. What'd you eat? I was like, some Indian food. It was awesome. He's like, uh-huh. Goodbye. I got real work to deal with. So you've been through that before, where you make assumptions that are not warranted and you find out the hard way, right? And that's kind of our world. We kind of tend to make assumptions sometimes, whether you're into the Disney and Pixar theories that are all this big interconnected world, or you might have heard of the people that think the earth is hollow or the earth is flat, or that the moon landings were faked, or that Elvis is still alive, or the Bigfoot theories. I mean, I could go on and on. We have a tendency to see something in our world and kind of like the fantasy of it and kind of want to come up with things, but we realize at the end of the day, those things take a lot more assumptions than the more simpler solution, which doesn't And we like to complicate things, and so those things get very complicated very quickly. And all Occam's razor says is, look, probably the simplest solution is more correct. Now, I think a great argument, maybe it's in the back of some of your minds, would be, well, isn't the resurrection a rather complicated solution? And I would say, if it was just like I was just saying, believe this, believe it because I said it, believe it because I said it's in the Bible and you got to believe that. Like, I would agree with you that would be like, you could be like, that's the more complex solution. But in my view, actually, as I've thought about this over the years and kind of parse it, I think it's actually the simpler solution. Because the others require a lot of assumptions. And I'm going to walk through that with you today in what's called the minimal facts approach. Now, I introduced this last Easter for the first time, and I had 4 big ideas for you. I've reduced it down to 3, so you get 1 less this year. The big idea behind the minimal facts, it was this kind of approach has been really honed and put together by a couple of guys, Professor Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig, both very smart people. Other smart people have added to it, but they have kind of 3 stipulations. The first stipulation is that they will only consider data for the minimal facts approach of the resurrection. They will only consider data that about 90% or more of academics, very smart scholars, would agree with. Even people that are skeptical of the resurrection, even people that are not Christians, what would 90% of academia agree with? That's where they will start. The second thing is they will not assume divine inspiration of the New Testament. They will not assume. So that means anybody could look at this and they're not saying it's authoritative because God said this. They're just saying, let's take it as written record, right? And so it's historical record of things that happened in the first century, but we're not saying that there's divine inspiration. And what that does is when you say that, it brings more people into the conversation. It brings other academics in, which is good. And the third thing is, if we can establish these basic, what they call minimal facts, if we can establish just a few minimal facts, then no plausible explanation can account for them, as well as the resurrection hypothesis, that we must then conclude that someone could be justified in inferring that the resurrection of Jesus is the most plausible explanation of the data. So let's look at what they said. Now again, there's 12, at least 12. There's 12 well-defined ones. I'm going to give you 3. And the 3 that I want to present to you this Easter that are most compelling to me are the fact that 1, after the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty. Number 2, that disciples recorded that they witnessed Jesus walking and talking and being alive. And number 3, that the Christian church, despite opposition, despite persecution, has gone from a handful of people in the Jerusalem area to billions today. Those 3 things indicate to me that you are justified in inferring that the resurrection is the simplest, or for Occam's razor purposes, the simpler solution with less assumptions. Number 1, all 4 New Testament Gospels obviously record this. But did you know that also many non-Christian sources also confirm that the tomb was empty? Not resurrection, don't hear me wrong. They confirm the tomb was empty, and that's all the minimal fact we're looking for on number 1. So you have Jewish historian Josephus, you have a Roman historian Tacitus, you have Greek satirist Lucian, and then you have the Jewish Talmud as well. So what you have here, you have Jewish, Roman, Greek, and Christian sources all agreeing that the tomb was empty, that Joseph of Arimathea got this tomb for Jesus so his body wasn't thrown in a mass grave, because you wouldn't have been able to prove that the body wasn't just stolen from a mass grave. But this was put together. The authorities of Rome had it guarded and sealed. And so what you have here is you have the historical criteria of multiple independent written sources that indicate that the tomb was empty. Now, that doesn't speak to the immediacy of the claim of resurrection, but it definitely speaks to the fact that Jesus went to the cross, died, was buried in this tomb, and then was not in the tomb anymore. Historian and skeptic Michael Grant conceded that the historian cannot justifiably deny the empty tomb, since the applied historical criteria show that the evidence is plausible and firm enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was found empty. Michael Grant is a skeptic of resurrection, I would add, but he says the tomb was empty. So it is a bigger assumption to believe that the Jewish authors, Roman authors, Greek authors, and Christian writers all conspired together for over 2,000 years. No one broke, right? No tradition ever broke on this, that happened. That would be a bigger assumption than saying what they wrote happened. Number 2, the disciples witnessed Jesus alive. You may not agree with them, but the 4 Gospels record that the disciples believed that they had seen Jesus risen. Now, could they be lying? Okay, maybe. But would they be willing to die for that lie? And to me, My kind of reasoning there is that they wouldn't have been willing to die, which they all had to die and face persecution, right? Save John. But all of them were persecuted for their beliefs and were martyred for their beliefs. And at any point, they could have gotten out of that death by simply saying, no, it was just a story. But instead, they were willing to die for that. I'm not willing to die for something silly. I doubt you are willing to die for something silly. And so their deaths are an indication of that, I think. And then that led directly to number 3, the growth of Christian church. The original disciples, again, the central message was resurrection. They were preaching resurrection, teaching resurrection. The resurrected Christ was taught throughout the book of Corinthians. Many hundreds of people said that they had seen this and began to tell this story and share this story. Others who believed in it did the same. And so this spread like wildfire across our world and continues to grow into the billions and billions of people that are celebrating Easter just like you are today in a church talking about the resurrection of Jesus, separated by over 2,000 years. So it would be outlandish assumption to assume that something could grow like that so much on a lie. That would be a bigger assumption than the fact that these disciples actually believed what they had seen. And so to me, all 3 of these go together to make a pretty solid case that you are justified in inferring that the resurrection is what occurred. It doesn't say it proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? But it's saying logically, this makes sense. And to me, applying Occam's razor tool, I go, man, it takes a lot less assumptions to believe this happened versus any of the other theories that have popped up over the years. And there's been a lot of theories, don't get me wrong. I've read almost all of them and investigated many of them deeply because there's a lot of theories out there, but what does it really look like? Jesus in John said it this way. He told Martha, I'm the resurrection and I'm the life. And if you believe Jesus is a good teacher, this is what he said about himself. Anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never, ever die. Do you believe this, Martha? He said, this is the truth. And then he puts the choice in her hands. Do you believe this, Martha? If Jesus is a good teacher, this is what he said about himself. So either I agree that the resurrection is what happened and Jesus is a good teacher, or if I say the resurrection didn't happen, then I can't believe Jesus is a good teacher. And the cool thing about this is he's like, you have to believe this, Martha. He does the same thing that we get today, choice. We get to choose what we do with the resurrection. And so like every Easter, we're on a path, and there's kind of a chasm here of these different choices, a multitude, if you will, of choices. But they're basically yes or no, right? Yes, I believe in the resurrection. No, I don't. Some of you for a long time have said, yes, I believe and I'm following Jesus. Some of you have said no for a long time. And then in between, there's a couple groups where you may find yourself. There's folks that are curious, but not quite convinced yet. And there's folks that are saying yes for the first time, saying, oh, wow, this is all clicking today. I'm getting it now. Wherever I'm at in life, boy, it is clicking, and I want to follow this Jesus. And so I believe from what I've presented to you today, from the scholarship, from the logic being used, that it is reasonable and a simple explanation, the simplest available to us, to believe, to infer that Jesus was resurrected, that that grave was empty because he was resurrected. And so if we review those scriptures in mind, once again, what would it be like if you put your name in this blank? What would it be like for you, friend, if you said, Jesus was saying this to me, do you believe this? And you put your name there. Do you believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life? Ultimately, you can choose to live in the world that celebrates Easter as a fun holiday, or you can choose to celebrate the resurrection of Christ. You get that option. But in this moment of decision, I want you to think about this for a minute, that the resurrection for you could be your life's turning point, if you will allow it to be. That's your choice. Martha could have said no, she didn't believe it, and gone on her way and lived a happy life. But she would have lived it without Jesus. She would have lived it living in that false world, that made-up world that has made-up stories. And she could have lived with Jesus being the resurrection and the life. So for you, man, will you let Easter change your life? Will you let this resurrection change your life for good?